tell us that, Eric? Or? Go ahead. But I mean, what are we going to hear overall? You're going to tell us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Should I stand up there?
Yes, all the speakers come up here.
Yeah, we have an intro slide, so that's what I'll. Okay. So, yeah. Cool. All right, so on behalf of the class, we'd like to thank everyone for their work and for coming to the presentation today. We put a lot of effort into the report and the presentation, and we would all like to give a special thanks to Sammy and Arnica because they compiled the report and compiled the presentation, and she even did it in latex, and they worked really hard on it. So special thanks to both of them. All right. So without further, how do I get it to go?
Further down.
Maybe back up.
Yeah. All right, so without further ado, there have been recent diplomatic and military escalations in the East Asian region. Particularly, North Korea represents a major challenge to its neighbors and to the global community. Their repeated provocations, both rhetorical and physical, are a constant source of rising tensions. Recently, North Korea has been conducting an alarming amount of missile tests despite consistent international backlash. Hence, our allies, Japan and South Korea, face the daily legitimate fear of attack from an unstable nuclear-armed regime. This has driven them to the dangerous gamble of abandoning international norms to seek assurance of their nuclear retaliatory capability. Our intelligence suggests that South Korea and Japan have covertly begun working on their own individual nuclear weapons programs. The U.S. must respond in the defense of the international community's commitment to non-proliferation, in support of global peace and security, and in line with its own bilateral security agreements. In line with these goals, President Trump has stated his determination to reverse these proliferation events and to retain U.S. influence in the East Asian sphere. This presentation summarizes our research in this unprecedented matter and provides recommendations to President Trump to halt or dissuade South Korean and Japanese clandestine nuclear activities. We will first examine the evidence and observables associated with South Korean and Japanese covert activities, facilities, and materials. We will then discuss the monitoring details and constraints, resource allocation options, and emerging proliferation technologies. Finally, we will present political, diplomatic, security, military, and economic recommendations to dissuade Japan and South Korea from acquiring independent nuclear capabilities. All right, to begin with, we're going to give you some background on the South Korean nuclear program. So the United States and South Korea have been very strong allies since the 1950s during the Korean War. South Korea relies very heavily on U.S. military presence in order to ensure its security and its defense, and it is regarded as being under the U.S.'s nuclear umbrella for its protection. However, within the country, there have been some movements and some leaders who want South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons program so that it doesn't have to rely on the United States, particularly given the security threat of North Korea as its neighbor. In 1970, a nuclear program was considered by South Korea when the United States notified South Korea that it would be withdrawing its troops. Under the direction of a weapons exploitation committee, South Korea tried to obtain plutonium reprocessing technology from France. However, after 5 years of political pressure from its ally, the United States, the U.S. was able to convince South Korea to stop any further development of a nuclear program, and South Korea joined the NPT in 1975. Some constraints that the United States would have on monitoring South Korea is that South Korea is the United States' 6th largest trading partner. South Korea received lots of U.S. aid following the Korean War. It does not any longer, but there are still very strong economic ties between the two countries. Two-way trade in good in 2015 was $113.8 billion, and in services it was $33.4 billion. So if South Korea had an idea that the United States was spying on them, it could very much hurt their economic and diplomatic relationship.
Other factors that would affect monitoring is that in addition to economically and diplomatically, the United States is South Korea's major ally in the military. It maintains over 20,000 troops in South Korea currently, including the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine, in order to support its defense treaty for South Korea against any external aggression. On a per capita basis, South Korea sends the highest numbers of students to the United States to study, more than any other industrialized country. Furthermore, the United States is motivated on personal interest to keep its troops in South Korea, so to keep this military and diplomatic relationship. It's cheap to keep our troops there. They have been there for many years, and we want a presence in that region because of the threat of Russia and China. Furthermore, the geography of South Korea presents many mountainous areas, which would make it hard to find some covert facilities that might be there.
All right. So I will present the history of Japan's nuclear program, which presents some unique challenges. After defeat in World War II, Japan authored Article 9 of the Constitution, which makes Japan renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. And in order to accomplish this, land, sea, and air forces with war potential have been effectively banned. Now, since 1955, with the founding of the Liberal Democratic Party, that party has sought to change this, to dilute the peacetime constitution, as they call it, and to expand the powers. So military institutions and weapons considered critical to self-defense have always been deemed constitutional under Article 9, and under certain leaders, the possible development of nuclear weapons has been considered under this defensive stance. Former Prime Minister of Japan, Nobusuke Kishi, Shinzo Abe's maternal grandfather, said that as long as we don't leave the sphere of self-defense, I have no objection to having nuclear weapons. And his grandson, the current Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has also stated in 2002 that defensive nuclear weapons would be allowed under Article 9. In addition, Abe has continued to reinterpret Article 9, and in December 2014, the Diet passed a resolution allowing missile defense and collective self-defense of South Korea, which means that they actually do have some amount of deployable war potential in defending South Korea from attack from the north. Before signing the NPT, Japan set up the 3 non-nuclear principles to reassure the United States that it would not develop nuclear weapons, and these were ensconced in the 4 pillars of nuclear policy. So in 1967, former Prime Minister Sato stated that Japan will not possess, manufacture, or permit nuclear weapons to be transported through Japanese territory. These principles have been violated in the case of the U.S. transporting territory through Japan, and Japanese leadership has shown certain inclinations at certain periods of time to develop nuclear weapons. In addition, the 4th pillar of the 4 pillars of nuclear policy allows Japan, in the case that they undergo a significant security threat, such as no longer having a U.S. nuclear umbrella, it allows Japan to ease out of the non-nuclear principles and possibly acquire its own weapon. So Japan has had an active nuclear weapons program in the past. In 1950s, Shiroki Matsutaro and Nakasone Yasuhiro had developed a nuclear weapons program. The first nuclear power plant in Japan was a dual-use plutonium production and nuclear power plant. And Nakasone, during his time as prime minister and afterwards, had openly contemplated the possibility of Japan developing nuclear weapons. So what would constraints be on Japan's plutonium stockpile? Japan is the only non-nuclear weapons country to have domestic reprocessing facilities. They have large stores of plutonium, approximately 11 metric tons on their territory and more abroad. But since Japan's nuclear energy program existed for 15 years before the safeguards regime was put in place, there might be hundreds of kilos that are of plutonium that are away from safeguard and therefore might have the possibility of being used in a future nuclear weapons program. So I move on to the next presenter.
All right, guys, I'm Lakshay, and this is Kyle. We'll be talking about weapons paths to weaponization. So Japan already has a nuclear domestic industry, since the domestic industry usually exists. Ideally, for new countries that are developing weapons program, the hardest part is developing and implementing enrichment sites. Since Japan already has this, and the ease of which a uranium weapon could be used rather than plutonium leads us to believe that Japan would likely use uranium as a fissile material. Current stockpile in Japan, uranium. There's large stockpiles of weapons-grade uranium or low-enriched uranium in Japan due to the shutdown of the reactors since Fukushima. Cutting off the uranium supply, since they already have low uranium in stock, would not lead to any promise. Japan also sends its nuclear fuel for reprocessing in Europe, since 6,400 tons of uranium has been reprocessed and currently stored in France and UK. All right, mining. So requirements of the 8,000 tons of uranium are met from other countries. Japan has 2 mines that can mine uranium. One of them is decommissioned. The second one is Tono, that's listed above. Usually when you refine an ore of uranium, after mining, you need to refine it next door. Ideally, the refining and the mining process is located next to each other. Refining process involves a heat leaching process of uranium ore, which produces tails and other byproducts. Essentially, if Japan tries to open the mine, it would be very difficult to hide just because of the environmental and other things that are visible. So obtaining yellow cake for Japan is probably the hardest part for them to become proliferate. Enrichment. So Rokaso plant has 7 cascades of 150,000 separated working units. So in order for them to enrich to 95%, we can expect a breakout time to 3.3 days, and using the low enriched uranium fuel that's already stored in the country, we can expect this to be broken down to 1.2 days. So now South Korea. So they have no established domestic fuel cycle. Enriched uranium is imported from other countries. Like mentioned earlier, production of 239 plutonium is cheaper than enriching uranium. So which is why we believe South Korea is likely to use plutonium as a fissile material. Reprocessing is a dirty process. So the chemicals we can trace for this process are nitric acid, tributyl phosphate, and sulfur ferrosulfonate. If South Korean government is really to disregard safety and health, entire reprocessing could be done in warehouse-sized building. So since they have no reprocessing facility, converting an existing industrial plant or creating a new one would add to the proliferation time, where a diplomatic solution might be more feasible compared to Japan, where you're looking at matter of weeks for them to obtain a weapon. So to make plutonium, enough plutonium, you need to go through a low burn-up rate. What low burn-up rate is 400 megawatts days per ton, or metric day, 400 megawatts days per ton of uranium. Reactor types usually operate within 30 to 40,000 megawatts days per ton. This is a low estimate. You can expect this number to be as high as 50,000 in some cases too. South Korean reactors are pressurized water reactors. If those reactors were used to make plutonium, it would be easily detectable, as essentially they're not producing any electricity to the grid, so we can just track that. The other type of reactors in South Korea are pressurized heavy water reactors, also known as CANDU reactors. These are probably the most problematic, as refueling can be done online and it's not as easy to detect. Ideally, if you're expecting, you can expect a refueling every 30 days for them to produce plutonium.
So now I'll talk about some of the weapons delivery capabilities that Japan and South Korea currently possess. Japan has a well-established rocket industry, and their Epsilon rocket has shown 2 for 2 successful launches. This is a solid-fueled rocket, so it lends itself well to nuclear weapons delivery systems, as it doesn't have to be refueled prior to launch, and it also doesn't require fuel storage facilities near the launch location. This rocket is manufactured by IHI Aerospace, so if it were to be weaponized, we would expect work to be done with them. And currently, it's only launched from one location, so significant work would have to be done building dispersed and hardened launch facilities if they want to use this as an effective deterrent. Japan's most likely weapons delivery system is their current multi-purpose fighter aircraft. They do have what we feel to be a distinct advantage in that they produce these aircraft domestically, even though they're based off of US designs. This would enable them to perform any modifications necessary to the aircraft, potentially covertly, without having to work with United States suppliers or work with their own engineering firms in the country to modify the aircraft. Since they build them in-house, this would be significantly easier. They currently do not possess any effective cruise missiles, which could be used to deliver nuclear weapons. South Korea, on the other hand, does possess very capable cruise missiles, which we believe would be their most likely option for nuclear weapons delivery system. These are manufactured by LIG Next 1, so work would be done with them to retrofit these weapons with a nuclear warhead. They're currently ship or ground or air-launched cruise missiles. They possess 9 ships which are capable of launching these missiles, and are currently developing submarines which are also capable of launching them. South Korea doesn't at the moment have any credible ICBM launch platforms. For the rockets they do possess, they've worked with Presentaitons, which is a Russian company, for the first stage, and their domestic aerospace resource organization, CARI. Similar to Japan, they do also possess numerous multi-purpose fighter aircraft, although distinctly different from Japan, they purchase these from the United States manufacturers, which would make it more difficult to perform any modifications which they feel are necessary to deliver nuclear weapons.
The F-16s nuclear capable?
The United States has armed our F-16s with nuclear weapons. From my perspective, as long as the hardpoints are capable of holding the weapon and the aircraft electronics are hardened against the electromagnetic radiation which is released during the weapon to enable the aircraft not to crash after or lose control, then they should be capable of carrying nuclear weapons.
So I'm Eric Matthews. Our group was tasked with assessing whether there would be methods for the international community to restrict access to technology needed by a nuclear weapons program. So for our assessment of Japan, as has been stated, Japan has advanced enrichment capabilities. The Rokasho complex has the capability to enrich enough uranium for one device in 1 to 3 days, depending on whether natural uranium or low enriched uranium to start with. Uranium devices offer an advantage in that they can be built with a gun type device. Uranium has a low spontaneous fission rate. It requires a less of stringent insertion time, and therefore the design is more simple. Another advantage that Japan has is that all but 3 of their nuclear reactors are shut down. After the Fukushima Daiichi incident, all of their reactors were shut down. Only 3 have been brought back online, and therefore Japan has a large stockpile of low-enriched fuel. This makes it difficult for the international community to cut off Japan's fuel supply. It also has limited consequences to the Japanese economy, as it wouldn't have a large impact to the Japanese power grid. Given these advanced capabilities, proliferation can be possible in a matter of months, and we conclude that there isn't a feasible technological barrier that the international could put up for Japan. For South Korea, the situation is a little different. South Korea has no existing enrichment facilities, and it also doesn't have any existing reprocessing facilities. Building either of these 2 would add latency to their program. Also, South Korea's fuel supply is highly dependent on other countries, and they could be cut off through the nuclear suppliers group. If their fuel supply is cut off, South Korea has 2 options. They could mine their 6 natural uranium reserves, or they could use the remainder of their civilian nuclear fuel stockpile. Both of these come with drawbacks. If they use their civilian nuclear power fuel, that could impact their economy because it would impact their power grid. All of South Korea's nuclear reactors are currently operating and providing power for civilian uses. If South Korea were to begin to mine its uranium reserves, that would add latency to their program because they would have to work on the development of those mines. South Korea, though, does have some current capabilities. They have 4 CANDU reactors. As was previously stated, CANDU reactors are ideal for producing weapons-grade plutonium because you can do online refueling with these reactors and go through several low burn-up fuel cycles. So given these reactor cores and the fact that a reprocessing plant would be cheaper and more expedient than an enrichment facility, we believe that South Korea would pursue a plutonium device. And it's important to note that a plutonium device is more sophisticated than a uranium device. It requires a highly symmetric spherical implosion. So this would be more difficult to engineer and would add more latency to their program where if they had a uranium device. So because of these latencies and capabilities, diplomatic restrictions might be more effective for this country. But we do want to mention that if determined, it does appear that South Korea could proceed in spite of international sanctions. However, their breakout time would be significantly longer than Japan's. So now we'll detail some of the things that could be done to restrict South Korea's access to necessary technology for its program. South Korea is an IAEA member state, and it's a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. South Korea also has numerous technology sharing agreements with the IAEA and bilaterally with the United States. The IAEA can suspend a member's privileges and technical cooperation if they find that they're in violation of nuclear safeguards. So this decision would also force the Nuclear Suppliers Group to halt the transfer of nuclear material into South Korea. The United States bilateral agreements require the stop of exchange of nuclear materials and technology when a non-nuclear weapon state proliferates. And this option would be very accessible as it would only require a decision from the United States President. So a technical summary, again, we believe that there is not a feasible barrier to restricting technology for a nuclear weapons program. For South Korea, the situation is different. We do feel that there is some options through the IAEA and bilateral agreements with the United States to slow, if not stop, a South Korean nuclear weapons program. One other important conclusion of this is that we find that the conventional technologies that exist in each state are more likely to drive their proliferation than emerging technologies, as will be discussed in the next section.
Hi, I'll be discussing sort of the conclusions of our research into the possible role that emerging nuclear technologies could play in a Japanese or South Korean nuclear weapons development program. Any technology that would enable a state to obtain uranium from an unconventional source or enrich uranium or separate fissile material in a small footprint facility presents a problem for non-proliferation efforts because it would allow a state to bypass sort of the traditional nuclear supply chain, which is usually subject to monitoring. And it also makes facilities for producing weapons-grade material harder to detect. And so we considered a scenario where Japan or South Korea obtains uranium by extracting it from seawater using sort of absorbent fiber technology, and then enriches that uranium using laser isotope separation. And this is a scenario where Japan or South Korea could build a number of small, sort of easily concealed facilities that could be fairly dispersed to completely avoid any of the normal routes by which a state might acquire weapons-grade material. Just to give a little bit of background on the two technologies, there's about 3 milligrams per cubic meter of uranium naturally in seawater. It's there from the weathering of uranium-bearing rocks, and it's accumulated over the Earth's history. Technology for extracting this uranium from seawater has been under development since around the 1970s in both the US and Japan. And currently the cutting edge is to treat polyethylene fibers to graft amidoxine groups onto the polymer backbone and expose them to seawater where uranium and other metal ions absorb onto the fibers. With this technology, 3 grams of fiber can 3 grams of uranium can be absorbed onto a kilogram of adsorbent fibers over 50 days of exposure to seawater at a cost of about $12,000 per kilogram of uranium. This is an attractive technology because you don't require a power facility for this. You could just leave the fibers somewhere and come pick them up after 50 days. You wouldn't need a big facility with pumps and a big electrical grid connections. And fibers are reusable. So with some assumptions based on the setup of an enrichment plant that I'll get to in the next slide, a state could produce 11 tons of uranium within a year using 524 tons of adsorbing fibers, which would be sufficient to produce a critical mass at 95% enrichment. Laser isotope separation is a technology where the isotope shift of atomic energy states between U-235 and U-238 is used to selectively ionize U-235 and collect it on electrostatically charged plates in a vacuum chamber. This has been under development since the 1970s, reached pretty high level of maturity in the 90s in the US, France, Japan. But the punchline for this technology is that a relative enrichment factor of 10 is achievable on a single stage versus 1.3 for centrifuges. And so conceivably a very small enrichment plant could be produced that would produce weapons-grade uranium from natural uranium. It would require only 4 stages. And if you assume a fairly modest sort of laboratory scale input throughput for each of these separator modules of 10 milligrams per second, kilogram, you could produce a kilogram of highly enriched uranium per day, which would yield a critical mass within a year. So in theory, a pair of facilities using seawater extraction and laser isotope separation could produce a weapon inside of a year. However, actually bringing these technologies to the scale that you would want for a weapons program would be extremely difficult. First of all, no country has any operating plant using seawater extraction. And furthermore, a laser isotope separation program, even though it's relatively mature from a technological perspective, would essentially have to start from scratch in both countries, as funding for that research was essentially cut off in the 90s. So on that basis, we conclude that seawater separation and laser isotope separation are a low short-term proliferation risk for Japan and South Korea. Based on Livermore's experience setting up their laser isotope program, a 5-year lead time is pretty optimistic for operational facilities. And adding that to sort of a year to produce a weapon, sort of a breakout time for a nuclear weapon based on these technologies would be about 6 years. And furthermore, the production rate of a critical mass per year is not very attractive for a country looking to establish a weapons program. However, it's worth it to belabor the point that these technologies do present a challenge to nuclear safeguards and non-proliferation because of the capability to bypass the traditional nuclear supply chain and to use low footprint facilities to produce weapons grade material. Luca will be presenting how nuclear monitoring works.
Hello everybody, I'm Luca Kyle. We are going to talk about the main observable of a nuclear weapon proliferation program and of the US intelligence recommendation. So first of all, I look to the declared nuclear facility. We have 42 operational power reactors in Japan and 25 in South Korea. Only 3 are active in Japan. We have several research reactors, permanent shutdown reactors, and power reactor under construction both in Japan and South Korea. We have a major reprocessing and enrichment facility in Japan that is able to reprocess 800 tons of uranium and 8 tons of plutonium per year. And we have both in Japan and South Korea potential weapons deployment facility. The IAEA traditional method is to send inspector in situ to collect sample. Once the samples are collected, they are sent to the IAEA laboratories where destructive and non-destructive measurements are performed. Japan is a particular case because after the Fukushima accident, it's possible for the IAEA inspector to give only a short notice period to detect the facility in order in this way to reduce the risk of proliferation. There are also other techniques that are performed outside the declared nuclear facility, such as the satellite imagery, in which it's possible to detect unusual movements in and out the facility. Environmental sampling, in which it's possible to trace, to detect traces of tritium in vegetation, or also in the of fissional material deposit in the water nearby. Inventory with understatement of receipts and overstatement of shipment, and also video surveillance that is able to give continuous monitoring inside the declared facilities. There are also economical and financial observable. The US method of estimating nuclear weapons program can be classified in documentary, in which we examine documents and data made available through open sources and clandestine procurements. Also, estimation by analogy, so you compare the cost in the United States to the, let's say, the GDP of the local country, and network analysis that consists in monitoring the imports of materials, communication, and financial transaction in the country. Japan is has a huge debt. It's equivalent to 250% of the GDP. So it's very unlike that the government is going to take public money for funding a nuclear weapon program. However, we have to consider the risk of dark money, and also it's possible a collaboration between the Minister of Trade and Industry with the corporate investments. In South Korea, since there is a huge investment in energy, since at the moment 96% of the energy is imported by ship, and it's 1/3 of all the imports. So there are new investment in, let's say, in the energy production in the country. It's possible also collaboration with the family conglomerates. However, the risk of the South Korea is that since it's really related to the trade surplus, in case of sanction, the country would really suffer a lot. Now I give the word to Kylie that will present the U.S. intelligence recommendation.
All right, so I'll be discussing some specifics of intelligence collection in both South Korea and Japan. So before I get into that, I'll first discuss this diagram, which goes over some of the intelligence agencies within the United States that we utilize to collect this data. So in addition to the financial observations that he was just mentioning, we'll also collect some human intelligence, some satellite remote sensing data, as well as electronic data. And after that data is collected and compiled, that can be passed off to different organizations such as the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence within the Department of Energy. And that can be interpreted and give us some results to say whether or not, to suggest whether or not particular activities are happening. So one specific recommendation that can be done in South Korea is to monitor existing radiation monitoring systems. So there are a number spread throughout the country that can be observed. Along with that, there's also groundwater information that's collected and monitored. And in particular, it's measuring for things like uranium concentration. And if we see fluctuations of those over time or an increase, that may suggest that a particular site may be mining for more uranium or something like that. On top of that, there are other organizations that we want to consider, such as these large corporations which are capable of facilitating the development of a weapon. And also government officials are also of interest here. So within Japan, there are also some specific recommendations. So first I'll go over some target facilities, some targets in general that we may be interested in, such as the Rokisho complex. Not only does it have an enrichment facility, but also a reprocessing. On top of that, we also have some power plants that may be of interest to monitor. And also, as I previously mentioned, are related industries which also could help in this because they have experience in the electronics, the precision manufacturing, all that can be done in-house, such as Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toshiba, along with others which also have experience in the nuclear industry. So when you couple all those together, it's possible they may be able to assist. In addition, not only you need the raw material and also the manufacturing capabilities, you also need some experts in modeling. So it may also be of interest to have to monitor some people involved with things like nuclear engineering and physics and sort of see where they're going. And of course, government officials may be interested to collect data on them. So for these particular groups, here are some things we can do in particular. For human intelligence, ultimately what we want to do is we want to be able to collect any sort of intelligence that may be relevant to us. And also we want to see where these people are going. So it's possible that someone may be pulled off from their regular duties to go work on a weapon. So we may want to look into things like employee records, see where these people are going. In addition, we want to monitor electronic information, not only traditional ways such as monitoring email, telephone, these sorts of things. We could also actually monitor facilities, and we could monitor things like industrial controllers at enrichment facilities. Similar to what was done with the Stuxnet virus in Iran, except without sabotaging them, we could do things like collect data from these devices, and from that we could sort of interpret the parameters that are associated with enrichment in these other processes. And in addition to this, we also want to monitor these facilities using visual data to see if there are any large changes, such as shipments going through, and any large changes.
Okay, so given the potential monitoring that these guys just talked about, the question then becomes, what are the potential constraints on monitoring? So we're coming at this from a number of angles, but I'll start with bilateral policies. The long and short of it is there are none. There are really no political limitations to to the U.S. not surveilling on South Korea or Japan. There is an agreement called the Five Eyes Agreement, but that doesn't include either of these countries. The Five Eyes nations have no spying agreements, but both South Korea and Japan are third parties to this agreement, which means that they participate in sharing of intelligence, but it doesn't restrict any intelligence collection. So there are existing intelligence sharing agreements between the U.S. and Japan in both directions, the U.S. and South Korea in both directions, and between South Korea and Japan. In terms of, so I'll talk in a second about long-term impacts of being discovered. There are potential short-term impacts that could be substantial, including negative political opinion or potential diplomatic restrictions between the United States and South Korea, or between the United States and Japan, if surveillance was discovered. And we kind of have an example of that from the 2013 WikiLeaks revelations about U.S. NSA spying on Angela Merkel in Germany and other high-level diplomats from around the world. The bilateral, or the results of this event included Merkel speaking directly with Obama about it, publicly announcing spying between friends just isn't okay. And there are other retaliatory responses, including CIA officials requested to leave the country. Germany resumed spying on us, stopped sharing intel about China and Iran. So some of these impacts could have some similar impacts could have potential impact if U.S. surveillance of South Korea or U.S. surveillance of Japan was discovered. That said, the long-term impacts of that is pretty minimal. There was, after the WikiLeaks release, there was a Pew poll, is U.S. monitoring of blank acceptable or unacceptable across the world? And monitoring of citizens, leaders, or American citizens were all very strongly opposed, but U.S. views, the views of the U.S. remained favorable. So the long-term impacts on the United States in terms of international power prestige are probably pretty minimal. In terms of physical intelligence constraints, in South Korea, we find, if we look at historically how we found out about the South Korean weapons program in the 70s, it was primarily through human intelligence and from intercepted telegrams. And in today's landscape with electronic communication, that type of intelligence collection would likely be more challenging. So for identifying development of a weapon, we would likely have to depend on human intelligence. Sea-based intelligence is difficult around South Korea because of the sheer volume of shipping to and from the country, and because it isn't a large country in terms of land area. There's not necessarily a strategically significant entry or exit point that we could be monitoring. Additionally, satellite intelligence is limited by the likely tactic of development occurring underground or in covered warehouses. And because we have existing military cooperation with South Korea, human intelligence is likely the most viable option. As hard as identifying weapons development would be, identifying weapons deployment would be much easier. Satellite imagery, measurement, and signals intelligence could all be obtained to identify missile tests, launch sites, etc. But it would still require U.S. putting time and energy and effort into that, and that requires the acknowledgement that it'll result in pulling assets from other regional intelligence missions. It's also interesting to note the General Security of Military Information Agreement that was signed in November of last year between Japan and South Korea that could potentially give us, may allow us to obtain a glimpse into any coordination occurring between the two countries in developing weapons if that's happening, although given their political history with each other, that seems unlikely. In terms of intelligence constraints in Japan, many of the same challenges, particularly regarding sea and satellite surveillance limitations. Again, U.S. military engagement makes human intelligence a most likely approach. Additionally, placement of RQ-4 drones, Global Hawks, and other collection assets that are already stationed in the country mean that we could potentially detect radionuclide, seismic, or sonar activities and tests. Japan additionally is particularly vulnerable to American espionage because it doesn't have a strong counterintelligence program, and the existing placement of intelligence assets in the country. And while the government, after the WikiLeaks revelations, undertook reforms to increase the efficiency of their intel and counter-intel systems, there are 4 targets that American intelligence could focus on, which would be the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Chief Cabinet Secretary. And then the last thing that we looked at is what are the potential domestic constraints within Japan or South Korea in terms of what would their responses be domestically. And there's not necessarily anything surprising to any of us in here in this slide. In Japan, the risk, the blowback risk to us of monitoring Japan is small because the government would want to keep the program under wraps, and the strong anti-nuclear public opinion would result in really strong public outcry against the program. And public response would more likely be against Japan's program rather than against U.S. surveillance of Japan. And in South Korea, for different reasons, there's not likely to be severe political blowback because it will risk U.S. support and cooperation. Because of their proximity to North Korea and their closer proximity to China, South Korea needs to maintain some cooperation with the United States until their program is fully developed. That said, public response among South Korean populace would be expected to be directed towards the U.S. and outrage of our surveillance program rather than the domestic weapons program itself because of the public's relative acceptance of such a program. Nonetheless, in both South Korea and Japan, it's more important to focus on detecting illicit weapons development rather than waiting for potential deployment. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dan and Emily to talk about that.
So now that we've had a general overview of implementing monitoring schemes and the general constraints that go along with those, we'll briefly talk about some specific technologies that are currently in use today that we can use to monitor prohibited activities and to find prohibited or undeclared facilities. So first, and the most obvious prohibited activity is to test a nuclear weapon. But in 1996, a treaty was put forth called the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty with the purpose to ban all nuclear explosions on Earth. Lots of countries have signed and ratified. There are a few countries, key countries that have yet to ratify this, including Iran and the United States. There are also countries that have yet to even sign it, including North Korea. Now, because of this treaty has not yet entered into force. However, this has not stopped the CTBT of creating a preparatory commission to implement the monitoring scheme that will go along with the CTBT. So the monitoring system is the International Monitoring System, or IMS, and it's a network of monitoring sensors that are distributed globally around the world, meant to search for, detect, and provide evidence of possible nuclear explosions anywhere on Earth. So this can include explosions in the atmosphere, underground, underwater, all with yields of greater than or equal to 1 kiloton. So we can see some still low yield nuclear devices. Now the IMS will consist of 337 facilities distributed worldwide, and currently there's about 90% of them are operational. Within the system, they utilize 4 main technologies: seismic monitoring, radionuclide monitoring, infrasound, and hydroacoustic. And I'll briefly mention some more details about the 4 of these. So one of the most attractive options of testing a nuclear weapon is to doing it underground. This obviously creates a seismic signal when detonated. It's a very distinct signal that we can use that is very distinct from other sources of seismic signals, such as earthquakes or mining explosions, and we can use that to our advantage to detect and locate these nuclear tests. So within the IMS, there will be 50 primary stations and 120 auxiliary stations distributed across 76 different countries. Radionuclide monitoring is a technology that we use to test the air around suspected test facilities or nuclear reactors for radioactive particles as well as noble gases such as xenon. So within the IMS, we'll have 80 monitoring stations, 40 of which will measure xenon, and the rest will look for radioactive particles. To detect these radioactive particles, we essentially sample the air and filter it through a sampler, and then we measure it with some gamma radiation detection system. With xenon, we similarly pump air into a chamber where we clean it and essentially try to isolate the xenon, and then use a high purity germanium or a beta gamma coincidence counter to measure how much of the concentration of xenon is in the air. Infrasound is pressure waves in the air that are inaudible to the human ear. These are great signals for us to use because when nuclear weapons are detonated in the atmosphere, it creates large pressure waves that can last for a long time in the atmosphere and travel very great distances. So this means we don't really necessarily need to have a lot of these stations, but in the IMS there'll be about 60 stations in 35 countries. Now there are a lot of different sources of infrasound. However, nuclear explosions typically create infrasound signals orders of magnitude higher than all of these. Now, the way this works is they have sensors arrays of long pipes that essentially filter out the air and try to reduce noise, as well as sending this into a central chamber with a microbarometer that can detect micro changes in air pressure. Now, hydroacoustic is essentially the same thing, but now it's underwater, trying to detect pressure waves with a nuclear explosion that is either underground, near a body of water, or underwater itself. And in the IMS, there are 11 stations in 8 countries. Again, this is because, like infrasound, hydroacoustic signals have a very short dissipation time, so they can travel very long distances. They make use of 2 different technologies: a hydrophone system, which is essentially an underwater microphone that is suspended from the bottom of the seabed up into this what's called a SOFAR channel, which is used to trap essentially these hydroacoustic waves. They also use T-phase systems, which are attached underground next to steep islands, which can then, when the hydroacoustic wave hits this island and creates a seismic signal, we can then detect that. So in addition to the IMS and the CTBT, the IEEA and others have a whole bunch of other technologies they can use. One of the most powerful is satellite imagery. It's because this is a commercial satellite imagery, so this is open source and open and available to everyone, such as like Google Earth. Now, satellites have various advantages. One is that these are located in space, so they are free of air defense systems of countries, as well as they move very fast and can cover large distances in a short amount of time. They also don't need necessarily to have to be refueled or anything like an aircraft equipped with a camera or something like that. Now, we can use satellite imagery for a variety of things, such as looking at the construction and mining activities. We can look at these places over time and see what they're building. In general, we want to use this for feature matching for known facility layouts, such as a centrifuge plant will have buildings of this size, and we'll have these different high voltage lines and things like that. Or reactors will have these types of cooling ponds, and we can look at that and compare images to what we already know. And we can either do this with human analysts or with computer-generated or computer recognition software. We can also look at decommissioned sites, see if there's activity at sites that should already be shut down. There should nothing be going on there. And we also look for underground testing, where after a nuclear explosion, there's usually a large chasm that we can look for with satellites. Now, the problem with satellites is they have limited resolution. So with low Earth satellites, we can get about a meter resolution. With high altitude, we can get to somewhere about tens of meters. And again, this is in the commercial satellite realm. And we're always subject to cloud cover or underground facilities, as well as, we only have the satellites covering a certain area for a certain period of the day. And so if countries are aware of this, they can bypass the system. But now there's new capabilities, such as stereo capabilities, as well as shadow analysis, to look at coming up with 3D models of these systems just from two-dimensional images from space. And we also have new satellite-based technology such as thermal imaging and multispectral, where thermal can look at heat signatures from facilities such as cooling ponds to see when the reactor is operational or not. And multispectral is a way to look and identify materials within a facility that gives you an idea and can better boost your idea or your ability to match these different facilities to facilities that we already know of and what they're currently made of.
So Dan gave a good overview of the IMS network and its role in the detection of nuclear tests. For nuclear security objectives, however, detecting a nuclear explosion comes too late. Ideally, you would want to detect a nuclear weapons program before the achievement of a nuclear device. Like satellite imagery, environmental sensing is an effective means for detecting prohibited nuclear activities. Both Japan and South Korea have agreed to the IAEA Additional Protocol, which allows the IAEA to environmentally monitor undeclared locations when deemed necessary. The undeclared nuclear activities of most concern are isotope separation and transmutation. Separation can be categorized into conversion and enrichment, and transmutation can be divided into nuclear reactor activities and reprocessing. Conversion plants create UF6, which is produced almost exclusively for enrichment. This makes it a highly specific signature. On contact with water, UF6 turns into UO2F2, which is an environmentally stable isotope, aerosol. In terms of detection, air samples can be collected using filter paper in suspected locations. The samples can then be separated and identified for uranium, which can further be analyzed for fluorine. Obviously, if UO2F2 is picked up in an undeclared location, it should be a red flag that prohibited activities are taking place. In terms of enrichment, centrifuges are the most common technology and the most likely to be used. Like conversion plants, centrifuges release UF6, however, in much smaller amounts. This makes detection extremely difficult. Centrifuge plants also produce power supply noise,
but it's not specific to the facility itself. That being said, as of now, there's no obvious signature for the environmental detection of a covert centrifuge facility. Reactors emit xenon gases, most notably xenon-133. Detection of these gases, however, is limited by atmospheric background created from declared nuclear facilities. Emission records have shown that the average background of xenon-133 is 1 millibecquerel per meter cubed. The IMS radionuclide network is sensitive at this activity level. This means measured xenon concentrations significantly above this level will cause alarm. An issue, however, is that nuclear reactor leases are highly variable, which makes it difficult to detect small covert reactor operations. In terms of reprocessing, the key signature is krypton-85. Krypton-85 has a relatively long half-life, which can pose a challenge. It means that the krypton-85 background is accumulating and it's subject to fluctuations. The inconsistency in the background makes it difficult to attribute krypton-85 concentrations from a declared or undeclared facility. At the moment, any approach to detect clandestine reprocessing facilities requires knowledge of the suspected location and the exact krypton-85 emission rates in that area. Air samples can then be collected on-site, filtered, and analyzed for krypton-85 to confirm whether prohibited activities have actually taken place. So now I'm going to discuss some monitoring recommendations. So given all of the detection challenges both Dan and I have discussed, as well as Luca, there's a need for further R&D in the nuclear safeguards and security regime. This table shows a few research areas and technologies that merit funding considerations and possible implementation. One of the more interesting areas is anti-neutrino detection. Nuclear reactors and explosions generate large anti-neutrino fluxes, which cannot be shielded by lead or concrete. With specialized detectors, we can detect and characterize the anti-neutrinos from remote locations. In addition to all of these technologies, we also suggest that funding be used for the expansion of human capital in the field of nuclear safeguards and security. This mainly includes the education of students. Currently, there are successful initiatives that are underway in this regard. These include the Next Generation Safeguards Initiative at ORNL, as well as the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium. We recommend that these and other projects continue to grow.
So we are going to present some political, diplomatic, and economic recommendations that we have to deal with the current situation. This is an overview of the recommendations that we are going to be presenting. The first political recommendation we would like to give would be in the case that South Korea feels abandoned by the United States as its ally. The United States and Korea currently have a free trade agreement called KORUS. And in recent times, President Trump has talked about renegotiating KORUS or even backing out of KORUS, which could make South Korea feel threatened because they rely so heavily on the United States and as an exporting country. So something that we could do is arrange a high-ranking meeting between U.S. and South Korean officials that would discuss the possibility of renegotiating KORUS. But if that South Korea stops their nuclear weapons program, then instead of withdrawing from KORUS or instead of renegotiating it to make stricter stipulations against South Korea, instead it could be renegotiated and strengthened to be favorable to South Korea instead. This would be a strong incentive for South Korea to cooperate with the United States on the nuclear issue. If South Korea and Japan feel that their security is being threatened, primarily because of North Korea, then another recommendation that we have is that there could be bilateral high-level meetings between U.S. officials and their counterparts in Japan and South Korea, these meetings would happen separately. But the point of these meetings would be to reassure these high-ranking officials that the U.S. intends to continue to provide security for these two different countries. Members of this meeting could include Trump, Pence, Tillerson, Mattis, and their counterparts in both Japan and South Korea. In the military recommendations, we'll talk more about some possible recommendations for steps we can take in these talks or in order to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. But the point of it would be having a political guarantee that South Korea and Japan will remain under the United States' protection. And if we can do that, it is less likely that they will withdraw from the NPT by saying that there are extraordinary circumstances, given that they still have the United States as their military ally. Another political step that we could take is that the U.S. could renew their effort to uphold the NPT. This would be in the case that South Korea and Japan feel that the NPT is irrelevant, that it isn't being upheld by other major countries, so they don't have any obligation to uphold it themselves. We would have a public announcement by President Trump saying that the United States will renew its efforts towards U.S. nuclear disarmament. Some things that we could pursue is a 1/3 reduction in deployed strategic warheads, which the United States has said it was going to do before. We can begin dismantling the thousands of retired warheads that we have. And additionally, the United States can enter diplomatic negotiations with Russia for both sides to reduce their nuclear stockpiles. On a similar note, we could also push for the United States to ratify the CTBT. As was noted before, the United States still has not ratified it, so President Trump could encourage the Republicans in the House and the Senate to come to ratify this treaty. By renewing the U.S.'s efforts towards nuclear disarmament, it would help the legitimacy of the NPT and would put more pressure on South Korea and on Japan to uphold their end of the contract. Additionally, for a diplomatic approach, if South Korea and Japan feel that their security is being threatened, again, most likely from North Korea threat, we would try to bring China to the table. We would want to hold a high-level meeting between officials from the United States and China, asking China to intervene with North Korea on behalf of South Korea and Japan to try to slow down North Korea's nuclear program or to stop the nuclear tests. We could capitalize on President Trump's more cooperative stance towards China and the fact that China's relationship with the North Koreans has been strained ever since Kim Jong-un came into power. We would ask China to threaten to impose diplomatic or economic sanctions on North Korea should they continue to pursue nuclear weapons. The reason that we would want to do this is that China is North Korea's closest diplomatic ally. It provides most of North Korea's fuel, food, and trade. So if they have stricter threats on North Korea about what would happen if they continued to pursue their nuclear program, North Korea just could not ignore them. And then if South Korea and Japan felt that both the United States and China were on their side and were helping them against North Korean threat, then they would be more inclined to stop their nuclear program.
All right, so the next recommendation we have is for the expansion of the scope and reach of the IAEA. So the safeguard agreements have given the IAEA access to undeclared activities in 70 countries, including South Korea and Japan. However, the agency's legal authority is limited to nuclear material and not weaponization activity. Therefore, we recommend activities involving high energy, high flux neutron generators, high explosive lenses, and the like. Our next diplomatic recommendation is to improve South Korean, Japanese, and U.S. trilateral relations. We could do so by urging Congress to pass bills and resolutions encouraging greater trilateral cooperation. The U.S. should also remind these nations that they have already agreed to strengthen trilateral cooperation on North Korean policy, and they have already agreed on 3 primary goals to achieve together. They could also encourage bilateral and multilateral meetings amongst these nations. It is in the U.S. security interest to foster improved trilateral relationships between these 3 nations currently, because this can help foster anti-nuclear policy. Currently, South Korea is economically heavily reliant on China, and South Korea has negative views towards Japan, which strains these relationships. Therefore, it is the U.S.'s responsibility to help better these diplomatic relationships. Our next diplomatic recommendation is to put domestic pressure on the Japanese government. We could do so by encouraging the belief that the development of nuclear arms would strain these US and Japanese relations. We could also threaten to give the 1-year notice of leaving the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. Currently, the US is one of Japan's strongest allies, which gives it the leverage to implement these sorts of external pressures on the Japanese government. In addition, with the North Korean threat lingering over Japan, it is less than ideal for the US military to pull out as an ally. Furthermore, internal political pressure by the people will likely push the Japanese to halt development for the sake of national security. And lastly, our economic recommendation is to impose sanctions on Japan, and we can do so by using the NPT as a leverage to compel countries to comply with these sanctions, because signatories to the NPT are obliged to prevent the spread of proliferation. Energy import sanctions are significant because Japan relies heavily on imports for energy, and it needs a significant amount of energy to support its country by powering its cities and feeding its citizens. So an energy-intensive nuclear program would take significant amounts of energy away from the cities, which would also cause much objections by the citizens.
All right, so we just heard about some political, economic, and other recommendations of how we can dissuade these countries from pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Now we're going to present some security and military recommendations. And the format that we've taken is that we have 4 recommendations, and inside of each of those recommendations are some actionable items that the government might want to go through to do these recommendations. So our first is we would talk a lot about making these countries feel more secure. So this recommendation to increase U.S. military presence in the region would be aimed at making them feel more secure. In the process of doing so, though, we'd want to make sure we're communicating very well, as it doesn't come off as a threat. And we also want to be aware of how these actions would affect other nation states in the region. So the actions that we have for increasing military presence are first encouraging and increasing cooperation between U.S. and Japanese or South Korean forces. So that includes bumping up the frequency of joint exercises, which we do frequently with them. Next, we could increase our naval presence in the region. We have apparently just done that in the last couple of weeks. And another one is actually moving more troops there, so not just naval units, but actual physical troops. We've talked that there are about 29,000 troops in South Korea and a similar number in Japan, I believe. So that could be an action. We could also provide additional resources to these countries, so giving them more military supplies, planes, missiles, things like that. And then lastly, and this is our very extreme option, but we wanted to present it, would be actually going and stationing nuclear weapons in those countries, or if you were going to do it in a less brash way, you would put nuclear-enabled submarines in that region and make sure that the countries are aware of it. So then what we did was we looked at the escalation level and the effectiveness of each in order to kind of give a ranking of what we would actually propose. So you can see that the escalation and effectiveness kind of moves inversely. So low escalation levels we presume would be less effective, and if you were really concerned and you needed an effective action making them feel secure, you'd probably go for something a little bit higher in escalation. So what we would recommend is initially increasing military exercises, see how that goes with them, and escalate as you need to, also more effectively. So our next suggestion is not necessarily to dissuade them from pursuing a program, but to slow the program in the process as we're trying to dissuade. So that would be either going on through cyber attacks that we could take on their programs. We could kind of infiltrate their scientist community and get scientists to be used as informants and even to try and slow the programs down. And then lastly, we could this is the whistleblower action, which would be to take our intelligence that we've gathered and make it public to their citizens, and that would be depending on their citizens having kind of a public outcry and saying, hey, no, we're not okay with this. We need to shut that down. So then how we rank those, utilizing scientists as informants, we gave that as a low escalation level, and effectiveness is kind of unknown because it's hard to tell what reaction they'll have. And then in terms of implementing, it's kind of dependent upon what we're currently doing. We might currently be doing that in places. We have cyber surveillance and attacks. Surveillance would be low, and it's very important, so we gave it a high. Effectiveness and the attacks we ranked as a lower medium. That was kind of relying on the fact that if they wouldn't be found out. If they were found out and proven, that escalation level would jump up pretty quickly. But we think those would be a very effective method of slowing down the program as kind of for the Stuxnet type history. And lastly, leaking the information on nuclear programs. The escalation level we have here is high. That would be assuming that it came directly from the U.S., so not in like a covert leaking way. And then effectiveness, we put it medium because you can never be sure how the public is going to react. It could work really well, or they could say, no, hey, this is what we think we should be doing. Thanks for telling us. We support our countries even more. So those are the first two recommendations.
Okay, so the next couple recommendations are a little bit more extreme, and they're more high-risk type actions. First of all, it's the general area would be to threaten or actually reduce the U.S. military presence in the area. Starting off, the opening action in this area would be to just reduce or remove U.S. support for their militaries and cut off the flow of our military supplies to Japan or South Korea. After that, we could remove or threaten to remove the THAAD missile system and our ballistic missile defense systems from South Korea and Japan. And after that, it's removing, threatening to remove, or completely closing our military bases in the area. Which is an extreme option and has a lot of different sides to it, but it would definitely show our commitment to stopping them to have nuclear weapons. But it is something that could potentially backfire severely. So that's why on our grid, we have that listed as the last resort, and the effectiveness of that threat or action is undetermined because the influence from China, whether or not they would take us seriously, which is unlikely given the numerous benefits that having troops in the area would give us. Reduction in military support, it's quite credible. Our president is on record saying that they are willing to renegotiate our presence in these areas and our support for these countries' militaries, and threatening to remove the THAAD system and other ballistic missile defense. We determined that it would have a high effectiveness because they are reliant upon the shield that we are providing them. Okay, the final option that we have for countering proliferation is to remove or minimize the threat that the North Koreans pose against the South Koreans and Japanese. Starting off, we would probably try to cyber attack their enrichment sites and ballistic missile programs. A successful Stuxnet type attack in North Korea could shut their enrichment program down almost indefinitely due to the lack of their domestic ability to create these centrifuges. They're very reliant on outside suppliers, and if we tightened up our control of these materials, they could shut them down for quite some time. Bombing offshore islands and increasing the frequency of military exercises, as we previously noted, it would showed both to our allies and to the North Koreans that we are very committed to countering the threat that they pose. And it shows that we are not going to tolerate the behavior that they've been exhibiting. Next, and a significant step up in severity, is directly striking the facilities in North Korean territory. This would include their hard missile sites in northern North Korea, as well as their reprocessing facilities and any other launch platforms that we are able to find. Depending on the location and the public, or specifically Chinese reaction due to the proximity of these bases to their territory, it might be detrimental to our relationships with them. And then finally, and the most extreme option that we have for countering the North Korean threat is facilitating a regime change there. Now, this can be either through overtly having a U.S. invasion to completely remove the current regime and just destroy as many of their nuclear facilities as possible as part of the previous recommendation. Or we could alternatively use covert action to support parties that want the regime changed. Now, I already kind of discussed the evaluating consequences, but the cyber attacks it's kind of unknown what the direct consequences from North Korea will be. There isn't really a large precedent for a formal response from a hostile nation, but direct consequences are unlikely, even if the U.S. is directly linked to these cyber attacks. War games the current ones are currently already pushing the North Korean regime. So it's increasing the frequency is very risky, as well as bombing of, for example, we could bomb Yongpyong. We could bomb Yongpyong, which is directly off their coast, and just a show of force, which would invite a response, but it would definitely show them that we are serious. Direct military response, it would be a formal declaration of war, and the regime change would definitely be very destabilizing in the region. Once again, the matrix deterrence effectiveness for most of these are very medium because they are very heavy-handed options. But the North Korean escalation level, given the previous response of North Korea to any actions taken by the United States, it's likely to push them towards more aggression. For concluding remarks.
Okay, so this effectively brings our presentation to a conclusion. So I'm just going to go over what we've said in case anybody missed anything. So we've discussed the geopolitical context of Northeast Asia that sort of sets the stage for all of this. We've discussed the historical background of the nuclear programs in both South Korea and Japan. We've talked about previous attempts to pursue nuclear weapons in both those countries, so this would not be their first rodeo, as it were. We've talked about the political and intelligence constraints on the U.S. in monitoring these states, and we've talked about the technical aspects of how these countries would go about producing nuclear weapons using current technologies, and how we would go about monitoring these countries using satellites, environmental sensing, human intelligence, and so on. We've also talked about future technologies that could be of use, but we decided that they may not be the most important route to pursue in terms of monitoring for the time being. And then we've talked about how we could go about preventing these states from developing nuclear weapons. And I think we've realized that there's no one-size-fits-all response because the features of each country's nuclear programs are rather different, and the populations of both states would react very differently. And we've learned that there may be no technical means to stop a country like Japan from pursuing nuclear weapons because of their highly developed nuclear infrastructure. And then finally, we've come to a pretty comprehensive set of recommendations, sort of smorgasbord, if you will, of economic, political, diplomatic, and military recommendations, some of which are fairly mild, like expanding R&D and human capital and giving our friends jobs, and onto more intermediate and severe measures like cyber attacks, increasing military forces in the region, or pulling them out of the region. We've even talked about starting a war with North Korea. So really quite a smattering of things that could be done. So now I guess we'd like to put the ball in your court and see what you think and invite questions. So thank you.